if you were at the DAF yesterday, you were able to learn about the story of Kamso Bar Kamso, one of the most famous Agadic tales in all of Shas. This is the parts of the Gemara that we tend to learn on Tisha B'Av, because they focus on the destruction of the Second Temple. So the last thing that we learned was Amar Rabbi Yochanan an Visanuso Sherabi Zechariah ben Avkolas Hechriva es Beitenu Visarfa es Hechalenu Vihiglitanu Me'artzenu. That it was the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas that was responsible for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash ultimately and our exile. And the question is, what was the humility? I mean, if you remember the story, it was that this fellow Bar Kamsa maliciously maligned the Jewish people to the Caesar, telling him that they were not going to, they were basically rebelling against the Caesar because they wouldn't bring his korban, because Bar Kamsa had inflicted a blemish on it en route. So Rabbi Zechariah kept blocking any action of the Sanhedrin. So it was because of his humility that our temple was destroyed and we were sent into exile. What was the humility? Maybe the obstinance, maybe the conservatism, maybe the fear. But why the humility? The Vilna Gaon says, very simply, that the Mishnah in Sanhedrin tells us that when you're dealing with Dinei Nefashot, you're dealing with capital cases, which judge on the Sanhedrin presents his opinion first? Is it the most respected judge? So the Mishnah says, no, it's not the most respected judge, it's the Katan. It's the lowest person on the Sanhedrin. And the reason is because we don't want the most respected judge to present his opinion first, because that'll intimidate all the other judges who feel that they're not worthy to take issue with him, and everyone will go along with his opinion, and that will suppress justice. So Rabbi Zechariah viewed himself as the smallest on the Sanhedrin. So any time a suggestion was offered, he chimed in and said, no, I want to state my opinion first, because he viewed himself as being the smallest. This was a false humility, which can sometimes be as destructive, as we see from this Gemara, as arrogance. Now, as a result of this, Shadar ilu yayu l'Neron Caesar, the Caesar sent Nero in order to besiege Jerusalem and to punish them for their rebellion against the Caesar. Ki ka'asi shada gira lemizrach, asa nafal b'Yerushalayim, l'marav asa nafal b'Yerushalayim, la'arba ruchos hashamayim asa nafal b'Yerushalayim. And Nero comes to Israel, and of course this seems to be metaphorical. He shoots an arrow in the air, and the arrow shoots it, he shoots it to the east, it falls in Jerusalem. Then he turns around and he shoots an arrow to the west, and it lands in Jerusalem. He shoots an arrow in all different directions and it lands in Jerusalem. So this is a sign that destruction is meant for Jerusalem. He turns to a child, Jewish child, he says, tell me what pasuk you learned in school today. He quotes a pasuk from Yecheskel, where God says, I will place my vengeance upon Edom, upon Rome, for what they have done to the Jewish people. And I will let the Jewish people wreak vengeance upon them. So Amar Kutchabrichu boy l'chruve beise boy l'chapur yadi be'ahu gavra. So Nero says, I see what's going on here. God plans to destroy his temple, and he wants to pin it on me. He wants to blame me, and I'm going to have to take the blame for this, and I'm going to eventually be the one who's going to be hurt by this. So Orak va'azal v'igayer v'nafak minei Rebbe Meir. So he went then and converted to Judaism. He says, I'm going to have to join the Jewish people. I can't fight them. And therefore, descended from him was Rebbe Meir. Shadre iluyayu la'aspasyanus Caesar. And so therefore he sends his replacement, he sends Vespasian, the Roman ruler, and Asad Sarala Tlas Shnei, and he besieges Jerusalem for 3 years. Havu ba hanahu tlasa atire nakdiman ben Gurion uven kalba savua uven tzitzis akeses. In Yerushalayim there were 3 wealthy benefactors by these 3 names, and the Gemara will explain why these names. Nakdiman ben Gurion shenakdelo chama ba'avuro. Nakdimon ben Gurion was so named Nakdimon from the word lahakdim, or the kadam is to, like the rising sun. Why? Because the sun shone because of him. The sun sort of preempted or kept shining because of him. The Gemara in Maseches Tainis tells us a story that he was very wealthy, but there was a drought in Yerushalayim, and he borrowed a huge amount of money and promised to pay it back by a certain date if it didn't rain, and to pay back an exorbitant amount if it didn't rain, to a Gentile lender. And the last day came, and the sky was clear. And Nakdimon said, "Give me more time." And the guy said, "The sun's about to go down." So Nakdimon davens, and the sun stays in the sky longer than it should. And then the sky fills with clouds and it rains, and he doesn't have to pay back that exorbitant amount. So the story is that because he cared about taking care of Klal Yisrael at times of drought, that's why he got that nickname. Ben kalba savua shekol hanichnas lebeso keshehu ra'ev kekelev yotze keshehu saveya. Why was he called Ben kalba savua? He, by the way, was Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law. He was known as Ben kalba savua because anyone who came into his house as hungry as a dog, that's what kalba means, would leave very, very full when he would leave that by the time he was finished with the meal. And finally, Ben tzitzis akesas shahisa tzitzaso nigreres al gabe ksasos. He's called Ben Tzitzis HaKesos, literally means the tzitzis of the cushion, because his tzitzis would drag on cushions, because they would, everywhere he would go, his attendants would throw cushions in the bath, so he would never have to step on the ground. So his tzitzis would always be dragging on cushions. Others say that the word keses, from the word kisei, that his seat would be among the dignitaries of Rome. He was so highly connected. Chad amar lahu ana zayna lahu bechiti v'sari v'chad amar lahu b'dechamra v'demilcha v'mishcha v'chad amar lahu b'detzivi. Each one of them volunteered to sustain the Jewish people. One benefactor said, "I can provide all of the wheat and the barley." Another one said, "I could provide all of the wine, the oil, and the salt." And the third one said, "I could provide all the firewood." V'shibchu rabbanon l'detzivi, the Rav Chisda kol l'klidi havamasu l'shamei bar ben etzivi. The Amar Rav Chisda aklaba dechiti boishitin aklaba detzivi. And the rabbis praised the person who volunteered to provide the firewood, even though firewood is not an edible commodity, but it's a commodity that you need so much of it in order to be able to prepare and use the other commodities, to be able to make bread, to be able to use oil. Why? Because he said, Rav Chisda said, "I give the keys to all of my warehouses to my attendants, except to the warehouse for firewood, because that's most precious. Because if you have one warehouse of wheat, you need 60 warehouses of firewood in order to prepare that wheat, in order to bake it into bread. So therefore, the most precious commodity was the firewood." So So there was enough provisions to sustain the Jews under the siege for 21 years. No one would have to leave Jerusalem. But there were these biryone, these ruffians, people who were the aggressors. You have sometimes in the Jewish community like this even today, people who say, "No, we're going out to fight. We're not interested in conversations, we're interested in fighting." So Amr Lahu Rabbana Nefok V'Navid Shalma Be'Hadayu Lo Shavkin. So the rabbis turn to the Biryonim and they say, "Come on guys, let's try and make peace with the Romans, let's end this siege." And the Biryonim said, "Nothing doing," and they blocked all of the exits. Amr Lahu Nefok V'Navid Kirva Be'Hadayu. The Biryonim said to the rabbis, "Let's go out and make war with them." So Amr Le Rabbana Lo Mistaya Milsa. The rabbi said, "No, we can't let you do that either. That's not going to be successful. It'll be a massacre." So therefore, Kamu Kalanu Lahano Ambari Dechiti Visari Vahavakafna. So the Biryonim, in order to be able to gain the upper hand and to be able to gain control, burned down all of the silos and warehouses, and immediately thus began a terrible famine. So Marta Bas Baitos Atirta di Yerushalayim Havya Shadarti Lishlucha. So Martha, the daughter of Baitos, was one of the wealthy aristocrats. She goes ahead and sends her attendant. She says, "Get me something to eat from the market." Va'amr le'zi aisi lismida. She says, go find. She was used to only the finest of flour. So ada'azalis daven. By the time he gets to the market, all the fine flour is sold out. Asa amar la smida leka chivar dika. He says, I can't get you smida, but I can get you the next grade, which is white flour. So amar le'zil aisili. Okay, go get it. Ada'azalis daven. But that too gets sold out. So asa va'amar la chivar leka gushkara ika. He says, I'm sorry, ma'am, there's no more white flour, but there's black flour to make black bread with. So Amar Le Zil Isi Li. So she says, okay, fine, get me that. So Ada Azali's Dabein. Asa Amar La Gushkaraleka Kimcha Disarika. But by the time he gets back to the market, that too is sold out. So he tells her, excuse me, ma'am, there's no more black flour, but there's barley flour, which is the lowest quality. So Amar Le Zil Isi Li. She says, okay, go buy it. So Ada Azali's Dabein. So by the time he gets there, that too was sold out. Now this is a comical, farcical story. I mean, after all, if I would have fired that guy. If I was Marta Bat Baitos, I would have said, just get me whatever you can find. But I think that this is a reflection of the fact that Marta was so used to such a high standard of living that she couldn't allow herself. She couldn't allow herself to ingest a type of food that only a poor person would. So probably the shaliach asked her at every juncture. He says, if I can't get the best that you want, should I get the lower? She probably said, no, there's no way I'm going to eat that stuff. So he comes back and he says, I couldn't get that best. Would you like me to get the barley? She says, all right, if that's the only thing they have, I'm starving. I guess we'll have to say. So that's what the Gemara is trying to illustrate. Anyway, have a shlifa misana amra epok ve'echsi imeshkachna midi lamechel. So her shoes are already removed, and she says, let me go outside, at least maybe I'll find something to eat outside. So esav laparta bekara umesa. As she steps outside, she steps into a piece of dung from some animal or whatever it is, and she is so disgusted from it because of her delicate aristocratic nature that she dies. So Kariela Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai haraka becha ve'ha'anuga asher lo nisisa chaf ragla hatzeg al haaretz. That even the most dainty and delicate of you, who has never even allowed her foot to rest on the ground, shall be so hungry that she'll eye her loved ones and try to cannibalize them. So Ika da Amri, others learn that Grogoros the Rabbi Tzadok achla vitni so mesa. Some say that her cause of death was not stepping into a piece of dung, but rather she tried to eat a dried fig of Reb Tzadok, and she became so disgusted by it that she died. We'll explain in just a minute what that is. The Reb Tzadok Yosef Arboin Shtin B'Taneis the Lolichar of Yerushalayim. Reb Tzadok, the great tzaddik Reb Tzadok, was an ascetic. He used to deprive himself of food and would fast regularly. He fasted for a total of 40 years on and off in order to stave off the destruction of Jerusalem, because many times when tzaddikim afflict themselves, they can bring kapara to their generation. So ki hava ochel midi hava mischase mevroi v'chei hava bari ma'isile grogoros ma'itz me'ayu v'shadilu. That when he would eat even the smallest amount, so he was so emaciated you could see it going down his gullet. You could see it him swallowing it. He was like skin and bones. And when he was in a healthier state, they would give him a dried fig. He would suck on the dry. He couldn't eat the actual fruit, but he would suck on the fig and get out whatever small amount of moisture that he could get out of the fig, and then he would discard the fig. He threw it away. And so she finds one of these figs that Reb Tzadok has been sucking on. She tries to eat it just to get some nutrition, and she's so disgusted by having to put this in her mouth that she dies. But apparently it was not an immediate death. She probably went nuts before she died, and this is what the Gemara is saying: Ki hava kanicha nafsha afikta lechol dahava v'kasba shadise b'shoka amra hay lamay mi boili v'hayno dichsiv kaspam b'chutzos yashlichu. That as she knows she's about to die, she takes all of her gold and silver valuables and throws them out into the street, and she says, what do I need these for? To fulfill the pasuk in Yecheskel, which says that at the time of destruction they'll take all of their precious metals and they'll throw them into the street. Abba Sikra Reish Biryoni de Yerushalayim Bar Achdi de Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Hava. Now Abba Sikra was the name of the head of the Biryonim, and he was the nephew of the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And Shalach le Tobit Sina Legaboy. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sends him a message, and he says, nephew, I need to see you. So Asa Amar Le'aremas Avdisu Hachi V'Katlusu Le'la Alma B'Kafna. Turns to his nephew and he says, how much longer are you going to continue this siege where Jews can't get in or out? He says, you're killing us all through famine. So Amar Le Ma'i Avid Yamina Luhumidi Katluli. So Abba Sikra says to his uncle, he says, uncle, what can I do? There's these people, there's such starkers in my group. Whatever I say to them, if I try to tell them to go easy, they're going to try and kill me. I only have limited control. So Amarlei Chazuli Takanta Lididi De Epok Evshadabi Atzala Porta. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, listen, just do something to get me out of Yerushalayim. Maybe I can affect some small kind of salvation. Amarlei Nekod Nafshach Bekitziri V'Leisei Kuli Alma V'Lishailu Bach V'Aisi Midi Sarya V'Agni Gabach V'Lemru Dunach Nafshe. So Abba Sikra says, okay, I have a plan. Take sick. In other words, tell people that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is deathly ill. Get into bed. Let people come and visit you and see that you're mamish really, really sick. Then I want you to close your eyes and take some kind of dead animal and put it in your bed with you so that it'll start to smell like a corpse. And v'li aili bach talmidach v'lo la'al babinish achrina delo liragshon bach de kalil at the inuyadi de chaya kalil mimesa. And then, when everyone says that you're dead, make sure that only your students transport your remains, your body, because otherwise people are going to feel you that you're too light. Because everyone knows that a corpse is heavier than a living body, and we don't want people to detect your lesser weight than a corpse would normally have. So, Avid hachi nichnas bo Rabbi Eliezer mitzad echad v'Rabbi Yeshua mitzad acher. That's exactly what they did. And his two disciples, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, were in charge of removing him out of Yerushalayim. Kimatu lepischa bola mitkare. So they get to the doorway, to the gate of Yerushalayim. The Biryonim are there, preventing Jews from leaving. And they said, well, we got to bury him. We got to bury him outside of the gates of the city. So they said, okay, but we're going to stab him through to make sure that he's dead. So Amar lahu yomer rabban dakru. They said, you can't do that. When the people see a bloodied corpse, they're going to think that you stabbed through a great rabbi. Bola mitchafia, amar lahu yomer rabban dachvu. So they said, okay, we'll just push him around a little bit. They said, you can't do that. You're going to see a disheveled corpse. People are going to think this is how you treat a great rabbi. So finally, paschule bava nafak. So fine, they just open the gate and they let him out. Kimata lahasam amar shama lach malka, shama lach malka. He gets to Aspasianus. He gets out of his, so he gets out of his casket. They walk together, they reach Aspasianus. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai greets Aspasianus, the general, and he says, peace upon you, O your majesty, the king. Peace upon you. Amarlei, michayves treik tal achada delav malka ana v'kokoris li malka, v'sui malka ana ad ha'idin amaylo asis ligaboy. So Aspasianus was a very cunning man. He says, Rabbi, you're liable for the death penalty twice over. One, because I'm not a king and you called me a king. And that's an affront to the real Caesar in Rome. So that's reason number one why you deserve to be killed. Reason number two is if you really thought that I was a king, what took you so long to come to me? Why did I have to wait this long to meet you? So Amarlei, de Ka'amart, lav malka'an, ibir malka'at. Lav malka'at lo mimsra Yerushalayim biyadach. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, the truth is, I know for sure you're a king. You're going to be a king at some point, because if you weren't, then Jerusalem would never be given over into your hands. Dichsiv ha'lavanon ba'adir yipol ve'en adir l'melech. Dichsiv ha'ya adiro mimenu. That it says in the pasuk in Yeshaya that the Lebanon will fall into the hands of the Adir, which is a mighty one. And the word Adir, thank you so much, and Adir always means a melech, because in the context of that same in Yirmiyah, it says V'haya Adiro mimenu umoshlo mikirbo yezeh, that the word moshel and Adir are associated to each other, and a moshel is a ruler, is a king. Okay. Ve'ein Levanon ela beis hamikdash, and the word Levanon, which says that it will fall into the hands of the mighty, of a ruler, is a reference to the temple. Shenemar hahar hatov hazeh v'halavanon. As Moshe says, that you will serve Hashem on top of this great mountain and this Levanon. So the word Levanon comes from the word lehalbin, which is to whiten, because the temple whitens the sins of the Jewish people. So that's how I know that you're a king, or you're going to be a king. And udika amarti malka ana mailokasis legaboyad ha'idna biryoni di ispan lo shavkinan. And as far as why I didn't come to you until now, it's because of these pesty biryonim that wouldn't let us leave. I had to figure out how to get us out, and it took me a little while. So Amarlei ilu chavish shel dvash v'darkon karuch aleha lo hayu shovrenes hachavis b'shvil darkon. So Aspasionis, again, he's a very cunning man. He says, let me ask you something. You said this is what took you so long to get out. Let me give you an analogy. He says, if there was a snake that was wrapped around a jar of honey, would you not break the jar in order to get rid of the snake? So he says, that's what you should have done. You should have burned down the walls of Jerusalem. And by burning down the walls, that would have basically stopped the Biryonim. They wouldn't have been able to prevent you from getting out anymore once the walls are destroyed. That's what you should have done. So, and you would have been able to come to me faster. So the Gemara says, Ishtik, Rabbi Yochanan fell silent. He didn't have a response. So Karli Rav Yosef Itema Rabbi Akiva Meishiv Chachamim Achor V'Daitam Yisakel Iboy LeLamemer Le Shaklin and Savta V'Shaklin LeDarkin V'Katlin Le V'Chavisa Shavkinan Le. So really, there was no reason for Rabbi Yochanan to be silent, because if Rabbi Yochanan had been thinking properly, he would have been able to come up with a proper answer. This is an example of how sometimes God takes away wise people's wisdom in order to be able to realize a divine plan. Hashem wanted Jerusalem to be destroyed, so, and this happened, by the way, in the Shoah too. You had great rabbis who unfortunately had their wisdom removed from them for whatever reason, because they told their communities, no, don't leave, stay, everything will be fine, right? So Rabbi Yochanan's wisdom was taken away, because he could have answered very simply. If you have a serpent that's wrapped around a jar of honey, don't destroy the jar, because then you'll lose all the honey. He says, in the same way, if we would have broken down or burned down the walls of Jerusalem, then the Romans would have been able to destroy us. That would have been the end of us. So, and we had no guarantee that we would be able to be saved, just like you can't necessarily save the honey. He says, what you do is you take tongs, and you find a pair of tongs until you're able to remove the snake and kill it. And that's what we were waiting for. We were waiting for that opportunity to defeat the Biryonim while still preserving the protective barrier around Yerushalayim. And that's what he should have said, but he didn't say that. So, Adahachi asa pristika ale mirome, amarle kum demisle kesar, va'amri hanahu chashivi deromi la'osivach beresha. So, while this whole conversation is taking place, an emissary from Rome appears, and he turns to Aspasionis and he says, arise, your majesty, because the Caesar has just died, and the dignitaries of Rome have decided that you are going to replace him. So immediately Rabbi Yochanan's prophecy comes true. So Havasim Chad Mesane, Boila Mesaime Lacharina. So Aspasionis had put on one of his boots or shoes, and he was planning on putting on his other shoe, but lo ayil, but his foot, for whatever reason, was too big for the other shoe. So Bola Mishlef Aliidach Lo Nafak, he wanted to find, so let me take off the shoe that's already on, but his foot had expanded and he couldn't get the shoe off. So Amar Mai Hai, he said, what's going on? So Amar Leilo Titztar Shmuah Tova Astilach Tichsiv Shmuah Tova Tidashein Etzem. So Rabbi Yochanan says, no, this is normal, because anytime a person receives a good tiding, as it says in Mishlei, that a good tiding will expand a person's bones. That's the reason why your feet have expanded, and that's why you can't get your shoe on and you can't get the shoe off. So Elamai Takante, Lesi Inish Telomiyas V'daitach Mine V'lichlith Kamach D'chsiv V'ruach Necha'a T'yavesh Garem. He says, how do you fix the problem? Get someone that annoys you, have him walk in front of you, and then your bones will go back to their regular size. As the Pasuk in Mishlei also says, that a broken spirit will cause a person's bones to shrivel. So therefore, if you want to get your feet back to their normal size, have someone that you don't particularly care for walk in front of you, and that'll bring things back to normal. Avid hachi ayol. So he did it, and it worked. So Omar Leyo me'achar dechachmisu kulei hayad ha'idna ma'ilo asisu l'gaboy. So again, Aspasianos says, you Jews are so smart. Why then couldn't you figure out a way to come to me before now? So Amar Lei v'lo amrilach, Amar Lei ananami amrilach. So Rabbi Yochanan says, but I told you, Your Majesty, that, we had this biryonim. And Aspasianos says, but I told you that, this is what you should have done. You should have burned down the walls. So Amar Lei mezel azilna v'inish achrina mashdarna, elaboy minoi midi de'etein lach. So Aspasianos then says to Rabbi Yochanan, he says, listen, I'm leaving. They're going to send somebody else. He may not be so nice to you Jews. Ask me for a final request, and I'll do whatever I can. So Amarlei tein li yavne v'chachameha v'shushilta de Rabbi Gamliel ve'asvasa de maskin lei le Reb Tzadok. So Rabbi Yochanan asked for three things. He says, give me Yavne and its wise men, that famous statement, give me Yavne and its wise men, the town of Yavne, which is where there was a yeshiva. Please leave that standing, even if you're going to destroy Yerushalayim. Please preserve the Sion, the bloodline of Rabbi Gamliel, which is from the Nasi. Do not kill off any descendants of Rabbi Gamliel. And the third thing that I ask is provide a cure for Reb Tzadok, who is emaciated and deathly ill. So Korele Rav Yosef Itema Rabbi Akiva Meshiv Chachamim Achor V'Daitam Yisakel Iboy L'Meimer Le'Lishavkinu Hadazimna. That this is another example, says Rabbi Yosef or Rabbi Akiva, of how Hashem took away the wisdom of a great man. Because really what Rabbi Yochanan should have asked for is, please give a reprieve to Yerushalayim. But V'Husavar Dilma Kule Hai Lo Avid V'Atzalapurta Nami Lo Havi. But no, Rabbi Yochanan's thinking was, here the Gemara interjects and says that Rabbi Yochanan's thinking was that if I ask him for too much, I'm going to end up with nothing, like tafasta meruba lo tafasta, right? Okay, so asvasa demasyon leila Reb Tzadok mayi. So we know what the first two were, but what was the cure that they provided to Reb Tzadok? Now, he was a man who was emaciated, his stomach and intestines were all shriveled up, and he was in danger of dying. So how do you save a person like that? This was a question that people asked after the Shoah, too, when you had concentration camp victims who were totally emaciated. So you can't give them regular food. So what did they do? So Yoma Kama Ashkiyuha Maya de Peri, Lamachar Maya de Sipuka, Lamachar Maya de Kimcha, Aderovach Me'e Purta Purta. So what they did was that the first day they gave him water that had soaked in bran. So it had a little bit of the nutrition from the bran. The next day or next few days they gave him water that was soaking in bran and a little bit of flour. And then eventually they soaked water in flour so that it had the most nutritive value, was the most viscous and thick. And so eventually, slowly, these expanded his intestines, and therefore he became better. Now, let's go back to our story. We know that Aspasianos now has become the Caesar. Azal Shadre Letitos Arasha, Va'omar E Elohemu Tzur Chasayuvo, Zetitos Arasha Shechire Vigidev Klape Mala. So he went and he sent Titus in his stead. And Titus would be the one who would eventually destroy the temple. Titus, about him, the pasuk says in Ha'azino that he says, where is their God, the rock that they place their protection in? This refers to Titus, who blasphemed in the most horrible of ways against the God of Israel. Ma'asa tofa zona biyado v'nichalas lebeis kodshei hakodshim v'yitzia sefer Torah v'over aleha avera. That one thing that he did, he flagrantly he took a prostitute, went into the Holy of Holies, takes a sefer Torah, rolls it out to make a mattress, and commits a sin with this zona in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Then it says, "V'notal saya v'gider es haparoches v'nase nes v'hayadam mevatzveitz v'yotze v'chesaver horoges atzmo." He took a sword, stabs it into the paroches, the curtain dividing between the Holy and the Holy of Holies. Hashem creates a miracle that blood runs out of it. Titus thereby thinks that he's killed the God of Israel. Shenemar shagut sorerecha bekerev moadecha samu oso samosos. And this is to fulfill the pasuk which says that the wicked enemy of the Jewish people roar in the midst of your meeting place, and they make their symbols as symbols when they're really meaningless. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sometimes gives false sense of security to the enemies of Israel if there's a divine plan that there should be destruction of the Jewish people and full punishment given to the enemies. Abba Chanan Omer, Mi Chamocha Chasin Ya. Abba Chanan says that when you look at from a divine perspective, who is like you, Chasin Ya, the protector, O Lord. Mi Chamocha Chasin V'Kasheh, Shata Shomea Ni'utzo V'Gidufo Shelo So Rasha V'Shoseg. That the word Chasin could also mean to refrain, not just protect, but also to refrain. Who is like you, Hashem, who is capable of holding back, and not lashing out at this horrible person Titus at the moment when he blasphemes so horribly. Devei Rabbi Yishmael Tana Michamocha Bo'elim Hashem Michamocha Bi'ilmim. He says you can use this another pasuk that we're more familiar with, which is, who is like you among the strong ones, O God. The word Elim could also be read as Ilmim, as the mute ones, that God, even though you had so much to say and so much to lash out with, but you allowed yourself to be muted in order to realize the divine plan. Ma'asa natalis aparoches ve'aso kemin gargusni ve'evi kol kelim shebemikdash ve'hinichan bahen ve'oshivan besfina leilach lishtabech be'iro. He also went ahead and he took the paroches, made it into some kind of sack, right? And he placed all of the precious utensils in the temple, throws them into this new sack, puts them on a boat, brings them with him on the boat to go back to Rome so that he can go to his hometown and show people all of his prizes. Shenemar uvechein ra'isi rishon kevurim uba'u umimakom kadosh ya'alechu v'yishtakachu ba'ir asher kein asu. He says that this is a pasuk in Koheles, that Shlomo Melech says, I've seen wicked people who are buried, and they come from a holy place, and they will be found in the city that they have done this. Now, al tikri kevurim ela kevutzim. Do not read it as kevurim, as buried, but rather as gathered. In other words, these people create a gathering of accumulated wealth from the spoils of the temple, and they bring it with them. Al tikru v'ishtakchu ela v'ishtabchu, and they will praise themselves thereby in their city. So, ike da'amri kevurim mamish dafilu mili dimitamran iglaya lahon. That some say that the word kivurim means from the word buried in the sense of like information that is buried, that is classified in secret information. That sometimes Hashem allows the wicked oppressors of Israel to be even revealed to them the hidden secrets that will help them gain even more and exploit the Jewish people even further. In any event, this is really the way the Gemara is portraying that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides that the Jewish people need to be punished and destroyed, so then sort of like there are no holds barred against the enemy oppressors, whether it's the Nazis, whether it's Haman, whether it's Titus. When it's time for destruction, Hashem says, I give you the keys to the kingdom, you do whatever you wish. So Amar Alav Nachshul Shebayam L'Tovo. But then Hashem wants to at least show Titus some level of resistance. So there was a huge wave that appeared before his boat, and it looks like it's going to capsize his boat. So Amar Kimeduma Anisha Elokehem Shel Elu Ein Gvuraso Ela B'Mayim Ba Paro Tavu B'Mayim Ba Sisra Tavu B'Mayim Av Hu Omeid Olai L'Toveini B'Mayim Em Gibor Hu Yala Liyabasha V'Yasi Imi Milchama. So Titus again brazenly says, it would seem to me that the God of the Jews only has strength in the water. He says, because their God punished Paro in water by splitting the Red Sea and just drowning the Egyptians. He drowns Sisera in the times of the Shoftim, and now he wants to drown me as well. Hey God, if you're so powerful, let's see if you can really be tough. You and me, mano y mano, on dry land. Let's see, God, if you got it in you. So Yatsa so Baskal v'Amr lo Rasha ben Benoshel Esav HaRasha Beria Kala Yeshli Ba'olami v'Yitu Shema. So a heavenly voice goes out and says, wicked son of wicked, the grandson of the wicked Esav, I have a tiny little creature that I have created in my world called the Yitush, the gnat. And Amai Karile Bria Kala de Ma'alna Isle Umafakna Lesla. it is such a simple creature that it only ingests and it never excretes. In other words, because when you think about it, the lifespan of a little fruit fly is maybe a day or two. It doesn't ever have time. Like in its lifetime, it doesn't need the complexity of a whole digestive system because it's going to die in a short period of time. So alayli yabasha v'tasi ima milchama. Okay, I'll put my lightest and simplest of creatures, and you see if you can defeat it. Well, let's see how you do against the gnat. Go ahead on dry land, and you'll see that not only am I the god of the water, I'm also the god of dry land. So, alali yabasha ba yitush v'nichnas b'chotmo v'nokar b'mocho sheva shanim. So, what Hashem does is He creates a miracle that instead of the gnat dying after a day, it remains alive for 7 years, and because it only ingests and it doesn't excrete, so it becomes larger and larger and larger, and it's now embedded in his brain, and it's pecking away at his brain for 7 years. Yom echad hava kachalef abava de beinafcha shama kal arzafta ishtik. And one day, Titus, who was of course suffering from this pecking in his brain, walks past the blacksmith, and all of a sudden, because the gnat hears the banging of the hammer of the blacksmith, stops pecking for whatever. Yes, it's distracted by the banging. So Amar Ika Takanta Kol Yoma Maisu Nafcha Umachu Kamei. Titus says, I found a cure. He says, okay, bring me a blacksmith. Every day they bring him a blacksmith. He says, pound away, blacksmith. Now, of course, this would be pretty annoying, but I guess if it takes away the pain of the pecking gnat in my brain, it's worth it. He says if the blacksmith was a Gentile, he was paid 4 zuz. If he was a Jew, Titus says you don't get payment at all. Your payment is the satisfaction that you see that your enemy is racked with such pain. So atlosin yomin avad hachi mikan ve'elach kevin de dash dash. But unfortunately for Titus, the remedy only worked for the first 30 days. After 30 days, the gnat got so used to the banging sound that it went back to its pecking, and Titus was right back where he started. Someone told me this morning that the Gaon says that's why we don't blow shofar Erev Rosh Hashanah, because once you get used to a sound, it becomes background noise. So therefore, on Erev Rosh Hashanah, we stop blowing shofar, so the shofar won't be background noise anymore. Anyway, Tanya, Amar Rabbi Pinchas ben Arova, Ani ha'yisi ben Gedoli Romi u'chishemes patzu esmocha u'matzbo kitzipor dror mishkol shnei sloim. Rabbi Pinchas says that I was among the dignitaries of Rome when Titus died. They did an autopsy. They opened up his skull, and they found this gnat had grown to the size of a desert bird, which weighs 2 selas. And b'masnisa tanaka gozel ben shana mishkol shnei litrin. And the Brisa says that perhaps sounds like it was even bigger, the size of a pigeon or a dove that weighs 2 litras. Amar Abaya naktinan pivshel nechoshes v'tzipornan shel barzel. And Abaya says our tradition is that its mouth was as tough as brass, and its nails were as tough as iron. Ki hava kamayas amar lei likluyuha lahu gavra v'livderi lekitme ashev yame delalishkache eloka de Yehudoi v'lokme bedina. As he was dying, his last wish was, I want you to cremate me and scatter my remains over the 7 seas. And this is a way to prevent the God of the Jews from finding me and bringing judgment against me. Thinking, of course, in his very physical way, that he could hide from the God of the Jews after he died. Now, ironically, originally he had thought that the God of the Jews was controlling water. And now he says, now that I realize that he bested me on dry land, then sprinkle me over the water. Not realizing that the Eibishter is in control of everything. So, Unculus bar Clonicus bar achte de Titus hava boi li giure. The famous Unculus was Titus's nephew. He was contemplating converting to Judaism. Titus is dead. Azal aske la Titus benegina. He brings up Titus's soul in a seance. Amar leiman chashiv be'ahu alma. He says, Titus, Uncle Titus, in the afterlife, who's important in that world that you're in now? So Amar le Yisrael. He says the Jews. Ma'olid buke behu. Amar le milayhu nefishin v'lo matzis l'kiyuminu zil igri behu behu alma v'havis reisha d'chsiv hayutzarei l'rosh v'goymer kol ha'meitzer liYisrael naser rosh. Titus says, I'm sorry, don't even try to convert to Judaism. They got too many rules. You'll never be able to live properly as a Jew. The best advice that I can give you is attack the Jews, because as the Pasuk says, anyone who attacks the Jews becomes mighty and strong, like we learned before. God only allows great people to become the persecutors of the Jewish people. So that's the way that you'll be successful in life. You'll never make it to the level of the Jews in the next world. At least be successful in this world. So Amar Le Dine Deahu Gavra B'mai. So he says, Uncle Titus, how are you being punished in the afterlife? So Amar Le B'mai de Pasuk Anafshe Kol Yom Machnashi Le Lekitme V'Dayani Le V'Kalu Le Umevadru Ashev Yamei. So he said, exactly what I had said on my deathbed is the way they judge me every day. Every day they gather my remains, I'm cremated again, and they scatter me over the seven seas. And then the very next day they repeat the process every day. So it's not a very pleasant experience. Anyway, the point that you learn from this Gemara is that just because someone dies doesn't mean they automatically become cognizant of truth. If a person was filled with falsehood during this life, that falsehood can remain sometimes for a very long time, even after they die, which is one of the reasons for Gehenna. It's one of the reasons of this purgatory process to help re-educate the lost Neshama. Azal aske leBilam ben Agida, Amar le man chashiv be'ahu alma. He then brings Bilam in a seance, who's been dead for centuries, right? So Amar le Yisrael mahu le'id vuke bahu. And he asked him, should I try to attach myself to the Jewish people through converting? Amar le lo sidro shlamam v'tovasam kol yamecha la'olam. And Bilam quotes the pasuk talking about Moab and Ammon. He says, no, do not seek out their welfare for the rest of your days. Stay away from them. Amar le dina de'ahu gavra b'mai. Amar le b'shichva zera rosachas. So he says, tell me, Bilam, how are you being judged in the next world? He says, I'm constantly boiling and burning and boiling semen. And of course that's because Bilam was a very lewd and sexually depraved person, and his advice was to cause the Jews to sin in a sexual way in order to distance them from Hashem, which is what happens at the end of Parshas Balak. So that's why he's being punished in this way. And then Azal Aske ben Agida lePoshe Yisrael. He then brings up the sinners of Israel, meaning Jewish sinners, in a seance. And of course this is a censored version of the original text. The original text is Liyeshu. He brings up Jesus in a seance, and he says to him, Amar man chashiv be'ahu alma. And he asks him, Yashka, who's important in the next world, in the afterlife? Amar le Yisrael. He says, the Jews. Mahu le'advuke behu. Is it worthwhile to be Magayer? So Amar le tovasim drosh ra'asim lo sidrosh kol hanogeya behen ki ilu nogeya bevavas enu. He says, of course. He says, always seek out the welfare of the Jews. Never try to harm them, because anyone who tries to harm the Jews is like poking God in the eye. So Amar le dine de'ahu gavra b'mai. So he says, tell me, Yashka, how are you being judged in the next world? Amar le bitzoa rosachas. Amar mar kol amalig al divrei chachamim nidon bitzoa rosachas. My judgment is in boiling dung, because the rabbis teach us that anyone who ridicules the words of the sages is judged in burning dung, which is really essentially what Yashka did, is that he denied Torah Shabbal Peh, and he told his disciples that listen to my interpretation, not to the interpretation of the Pharisees. So Ta Chazi Ma Bein Poshe Yisrael Nevi Omosalim. So Gemara remarks and says, look at the difference between Gentile idolatrous sinners and Jewish sinners. Jewish sinners are terrible in and of itself, but they're not as bad as the idolatrous sinners, because of the Avodah Zarah. So because at least at Yashka in the Olam HaEmes was able to realize the truth of his error, even though he's still being punished. But nevertheless, he's able to acknowledge that the Jewish people are worthy of clinging to. Tanya Amar Rabbi Elazar Bo'arei Kama Gedola Kocha Shel Busha. And in the final analysis, going back to the story that we started with, which is the Bar Kamsa story, see how great the power of shame is. Meaning, see how much HaKadosh Baruch Hu is willing to defend someone who is embarrassed. Shaharei Siyei HaKadosh Baruch Hu es Bar Kamsa because so much was Hashem indignant over the shame of Bar Kamsa, that he was willing to help him to destroy his temple and to burn down his palace. So this is a very important lesson that we learn of an issue of Ben Adam Lachavero, that if you shame someone, Hashem will quickly come to that person's aid. Have a wonderful day.